The Oracy girl did not move when I opened the door to the holding bay. That was the first thing. Every child I had ever assessed in 20 years of compliance work had reacted to the sound of the latch, a flinch, a scramble backward, a tightening of whatever the child held against their chest. The Oracy girl sat on the bench with her small hands folded in her lap and her amber eyes already on the door when it swung open, as though she had been watching the latch long before I touched it. As though she had been watching it all night, and had simply decided that whatever came through, it was going to come through it regardless of what she did. That is not defiance. I want to be clear on that because defiance I had seen plenty of, and I knew what it looked like: the chin up, the jaw set, the eyes too bright. This was something else. This was a child who had run the numbers on her own situation and arrived at a number she understood and had made her peace with, and the peace was not peace at all. It was exhaustion wearing peace's face. I had a data tablet in my left hand and a stylus in my right, and a compliance reassessment form already open to the first field. I was Rael Das, Senior Assessor, Kethavari Consolidated Commerce Authority, Orbital Platform Vardith 7, and I had exactly 47 minutes before the session window closed on lot GX4418, and lot GX4418 was her. I stood in the doorway for longer than I had stood in any doorway in 20 years. The holding bay smelled the way all the holding bays smelled: recycled air, the faint chemical note of the platform's atmospheric scrubbers, the particular staleness of a small room with inadequate circulation that has held living creatures for too long. The bench she sat on was the standard-issue alloy model, gray-painted, bolted to the wall. She was small enough that her feet did not reach the floor. She was wearing a maintenance shift 2 sizes too large. The exchange issued them because they were cheap, and the children swam in them. Her silver hair had been cropped close to her skull at some recent point, not carefully. The skin on her hands was pale green in the way the Oracy are, but the undertone that should have been a warm jade was muted, the way a plant goes when it has been kept from the light too long. She did not speak, she waited. I crossed the bay and sat down on the bench beside her, which I had never done in 20 years, because assessors did not sit on the bench beside the assessed. There was a protocol. The protocol said, stand at the designated assessor position, read the compliance categories from the tablet, log the grade, file by session close. The protocol had never given me any trouble before. I put the tablet face down on my knee. Foz, I said. I had read her name from the file on the walk down. Oracy naming conventions, 1-syllable aspirated consonant, a vowel that carries the family's chord. I did not know what her family's chord meant. I only knew the name. She looked at me. The amber eyes were very clear and very steady and very tired. That's your name, I said. On the file, I wanted to make sure they had it right. They have it right, she said. Her standard was precise, with the faint doubled consonant softening that Oracy speakers carry. Someone had taught her well, or she had taught herself. Either answer said something about her that the file did not. I looked down at the tablet. I looked at the first field of the compliance reassessment form, which said designation, and had GX4418 filled in, and the second field which said classification grade, and had a drop-down waiting for my selection, and the third field which said tier placement recommendation, and had another drop-down with 4 options, and the fourth option in that drop-down was tier 0, and tier 0 meant the processing contract, and the processing contract meant I would never know what happened to her. I had filled in that fourth option before, not often, 11 times in 20 years. I had told myself each time that I was not the one who had put a child on a bond lot in the first place, and that was true. And I had told myself that the compliance code existed for a reason, and that reason was the orderly function of a licensed market, and that licensed markets were how things got done in the contested territories, and that was also technically true. And I had told myself that one assessor's grade did not change the system, and that was absolutely true. And none of it had ever made me feel anything in particular, because I had spent 20 years learning how not to feel anything in particular. The Orphan girl's feet did not reach the floor. "Foz," I said, and I heard something different in my own voice, and I think she heard it too because her eyes shifted slightly, not with hope, because she was too careful for hope, but with attention. The way you pay attention to a door that might open. I am going to ask you some questions. You don't have to answer them for the form. The form doesn't need your answers. I'm going to ask them for myself. She waited. She was very good at waiting. "How long have you been on platform?" 41 days, she said. "Before this platform, I was on the transit hub at Varda 3 for 9 days. Before that, I was on my father's ship for 11 days. Before that, I was home." She said the last word the way you say the name of something that no longer exists in the form you knew it. "Your father's ship," I said. "He was a freight hauler. The Varda 3 authorities held the ship for a tariff dispute. They separated us before they told him what was happening. He does not know where I am." She said it with the same flat, exhausted precision. "The lot officer told me that was not relevant information for the file. I am telling you because you asked." I sat with that for a moment. The transit authority at Varda 3 ran a clean separation operation. I knew about it in the way that people who work in adjacent offices know about the things the adjacent office does. I had seen the intake papers. I had processed the resulting assessments. I had filed grades and not thought too hard about the provenance. The transit authority pulled juveniles from delayed or disputed freight vessels, classified them as unaccompanied minors under the contested territory welfare provision, handed them to the exchange for bonded placement, and split the placement fee with the relevant lot officer. It was technically legal under 3 different interleaved regulatory frameworks that had been constructed. I had always privately thought, specifically to make it technically legal. The lot officer got a cut. The transit authority got a cut. The exchange got the bond revenue. The child got a maintenance shift 2 sizes too large and a bench with her feet not reaching the floor. 41 days. "Foz," I said, and I heard something different in my own voice, and I think she heard it too because her eyes shifted slightly, not with hope, because she was too careful for hope, but with attention. The way you pay attention to a door that might open. I am going to make you a promise. I don't know yet exactly how I'm going to keep it. But I'm going to tell you what it is, and then I'm going to go upstairs and keep it, and you are going to stay on this bench and wait. And when I come back, the number on that form is not going to be tier 0. She looked at me for a long time. The amber eyes did not waver. "You are an assessor," she said. "Yes." The lot officer told me the assessors only come when the grade needs updating. "That's right." He told me my grade was going to tier 0. "He told you that?" "Yes." I stood up. I picked up the tablet. I looked at her once more, the folded hands, the feet not reaching the floor, the silver hair cropped close, the pale green skin with the wrong undertone, and I said, "He was wrong about that." Then I walked out of the holding bay and up 3 flights of service stairs to the assessor's office, and I sat down at my terminal, and I did not open the compliance reassessment form. I opened the Kethavari Consolidated Commerce Authority Regulatory Archive. I want to explain something about how I came to know the Regulatory Archive the way I knew it, because it matters to what happened next. 20 years as a compliance assessor means 20 years of reading the code, not the summaries, not the practice guides the exchange distributed to new assessors, which were written by the exchange's legal team, and which described the code the way that a building's leasing office describes a building. Accurately, in terms of the features that served the leasing office's interests, and not at all in terms of the structural irregularities, the subsidence. The load-bearing walls the original architect had placed in unconventional locations for reasons that made sense at the time, and that no subsequent tenant had ever thought to map. I had read the summaries and the practice guides in my first year, and found them insufficient and gone to the archive itself. And I had been reading the archive itself for 19 years since. Not because I intended to use what I found, but because I was constitutionally unable to do a job I did not understand. And understanding the job meant understanding the code. And the code was enormous and cross-referenced and internally contradictory in a dozen places and contained, if you read carefully enough, approximately 40 years' worth of accumulated legislative scar tissue from a dozen different political administrations, each of which had modified the previous administration's provisions without quite repealing them. And the result was a document that was simultaneously the legal instrument that had processed 11 Tier 0 recommendations over 20 years under my name, and the legal instrument that, if you read it differently, if you read it the way a man reads a building's load-bearing walls when he is looking for the one he needs, contained the tools to pull every one of those 11 back. That was the thing nobody at the exchange had ever understood about me or had ever needed to understand, because for 19 years I had never pointed those tools in any direction they didn't want. I was a good assessor by the exchange's measure, accurate, efficient, untroubling. I filed clean. I met my session windows. I never asked questions about provenance or raised procedural flags on lots that were moving the way the exchange needed them to move. I had been, in the language of the institution, cooperative. And cooperation, in an institution like this one, is what you call the state of a person who has decided that the cost of using what they know is higher than the cost of not using it. I had been making that calculation every morning for 20 years. This morning I sat down beside a child, and the calculation came out different, and I was done pretending I did not know what I knew. I could not pull the 11 back. They were filed and closed, and the children were wherever children went after Tier 0. And that was something I was going to have to carry for the rest of my life. And I knew it, and I set it aside because there was a child in a holding bay with her feet not reaching the floor, and I had made her a promise, and I had approximately 43 minutes left in the session window. I started with the Oraceae species classification. The KCCA Regulatory Archive classified species for bonding purposes in 4 tiers. Tier 1 through 3 were open to standard bonded labor placement. Tier 4 was the restricted list, species protected under the Vardith Contested Territory Accord, which had been signed 16 years ago by the then administrator of the platform as part of a broader political settlement, and which had been quietly ignored by the exchange ever since, because the Accord's enforcement mechanism was a complaint process that required the complaining party to have legal standing in the Vardith Contested Territory jurisdiction. And unaccompanied alien minors in exchange holding did not have legal standing in the Vardith Contested Territory jurisdiction. The Oraceae were not on the Tier 4 list. I had checked in that first 5 minutes because it would have been the fastest lever and it was not available. What the Oraceae were on was the Supplementary Welfare Schedule, Annex D, subsection 14.7, which was a 17-year-old provision inserted by an administrator named Korethvelen who had since retired, which established that any species with a documented primary caregiver tracing protocol, meaning any species for which the exchange's own welfare registry was required to attempt active notification of a separated juvenile's primary caregiver before any bond placement could be finalized, was subject to a mandatory 72-hour placement hold pending notification response. The Oraceae had a documented primary caregiver tracing protocol. They were one of 9 species that did. It was in the welfare registry, in a supplementary attachment that had been added 17 years ago and never removed and never referenced in the exchange's standard practice guides, because the exchange's standard practice guides predated Annex D by 3 years and nobody had updated them. I pulled the welfare registry entry. I cross-referenced Annex D subsection 14.7. I verified that the Oraceae were listed. I checked the lot file for GX4418 to confirm whether a primary caregiver notification had been filed. It had not. There was no notification. There was no record of any attempt at notification. There was no record of the lot officer or the transit authority intake processor, or anyone else at any point having checked whether the species in question had a documented primary caregiver tracing protocol, because the standard practice guide they were all using did not tell them to check. I had the first tool. I had 38 minutes. I opened a secondary terminal, pulled up the internal communications queue, and sent a formal compliance notice to the lot officer on GX4418. I sent a copy to the exchange's welfare registry administrator. I sent a copy to the session oversight desk. I filed the notice under subsection 14.7 of Annex D of the Supplementary Welfare Schedule, and I flagged the lot GX4418 for a mandatory 72-hour placement hold. And I noted in the notice that the hold superseded any pending grade assessment, and that any attempt to process a tier placement recommendation on the lot before the hold expired, and before a compliant caregiver notification attempt had been made and logged, would constitute a material violation of the Kethavari Consolidated Commerce Authority's own welfare compliance obligations. Then I sat back and waited, because it was not going to stop there, and I knew it. The lot officer's name was Suval Oker. I knew him by reputation and by file. He had been on the platform for 11 years. He was efficient. He was profitable. He had a very clear understanding of which provisions in the regulatory code the exchange enforced and which it did not, and he had built his operation entirely within the second category. He was not a stupid man. He was going to read my notice inside of 5 minutes, and he was going to do one of two things: either refer it to the exchange's legal coordinator or come upstairs. He came upstairs. It took him 4 minutes. He was a tall man, Suval Oker, broader than me, with the flat gray eyes that the Kethavari human strain tended to produce, and the kind of stillness that people develop when they spend years in rooms where they are the authority. He walked into the assessor's office, and he looked at me across the terminal cluster, and he said, "Das, what are you doing?" It was not a question, exactly. It was the voice of a man who had found someone touching something they should not be touching and wanted them to understand that he had noticed. "Filing a compliance notice," I said. "Annex D, subsection 14.7. The lot has a primary caregiver tracing obligation that wasn't met at intake. It's a mandatory hold." "That provision," Suval Oker said, "hasn't been applied to an exchange placement in 11 years. "No," I said, "it hasn't. It's still in the archive. The archive is what the code is, not the practice guide." He looked at me. He had the kind of face that reveals nothing that the owner does not want revealed, and what he was choosing to reveal now was patience. Calculated patience, the kind that tells you the person wearing it is deciding how much force to apply and in which direction. "The session window closes in 34 minutes, he said. "If the assessment isn't filed by close, the lot goes to auto grade. Auto grade is tier 0. "The lot is under a mandatory 72-hour hold," I said. "Auto grade can't apply to a lot under a mandatory hold. That's subsection 9.3, paragraph 2. Auto grade triggers on unresolved lots at session close only where no active compliance notice is flagged. I flagged one 4 minutes ago." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been reading the archive." "For 19 years, I said. "For 19 years, he said, and something moved behind the flat gray eyes, not anger yet exactly, but its approaching edge. "And in 19 years, you've never felt the need to apply Annex D subsection 14.7 to anything." "I've never had cause before," I said, which was not entirely true, and we both knew it. "Das." He put his hands on the terminal cluster across from me, not aggressively, just to anchor himself, to make the posture of a man who is being reasonable. This lot is flagged for reasons that have nothing to do with the welfare schedule. The classification comes from the transit authority intake, not from me. I don't set the intake parameters. I work with what the intake sends me. I know that, I said. The primary caregiver tracing provision, he said slowly, was written for a different kind of case. It was written for genuine abandonments, children found without any identified adult connection. This lot has a transit authority hold on the related vessel. That's a different situation. The provision doesn't distinguish, I said. Subsection 14.7 says any species with a documented primary caregiver tracing protocol. It doesn't say genuinely abandoned. It says separated juvenile, unplaced. She qualifies. She qualifies, he said. She qualifies, I said. He straightened up. He took his hands off the terminal cluster. He looked at me the way people look at something that has unexpectedly changed shape. I'm going to need to bring the session coordinator in, he said. That's your prerogative, I said. The hold is already filed. The session coordinator will see it in the queue. He left. He did not close the door behind him. I had 31 minutes left in the session window, and the hold was in place, and the autograde couldn't touch her while the hold was in place, which meant the clock had effectively stopped on tier 0. But I knew Suval Oker, and I knew the exchange, and I knew that a 72-hour hold was not a resolution. It was time, and time was what I needed to use, and I had 31 minutes in which to use as much of it as possible. I went back to the archive. The second tool was more obscure. It sat in the labor futures and forward bonding section, subsection 33 through 37, which covered the permitted parameters for bonded labor contracts in the Kethavari jurisdictional zone. Most assessors never read subsections 33 through 37 because most assessors were grading existing placements, not adjudicating the terms of the contracts themselves. That was the legal coordinator's office. But I had read them. I had read everything. Subsection 35.4 covered the minimum competency threshold for bonded labor contracts involving juveniles. It specified that no juvenile bond contract could be executed for a labor category that exceeded the juvenile's assessed cognitive and physical competency by more than 2 standard tier equivalents. It was a welfare provision, old, inserted probably as a concession during some political negotiation, designed to prevent the grossest forms of misplacement. It had a cross-reference to the species classification tables in Annex B. The Annex B species tables assigned cognitive and physical competency baselines to each classified species for assessment purposes. The oracy were in the tables. Their baseline cognitive competency was listed as grade equivalent 4 in standard KCCA assessment terms. The Tier 0 processing contract was a Category 9 labor assignment. Category 9 was the highest intensity labor tier the exchange recognized. Category 9 minus grade 4 equals a 5-tier gap. Subsection 35.4 permitted a maximum gap of 2. A 5-tier placement on a grade 4 baseline was not a borderline irregularity. It was a categorical violation of the minimum competency threshold, and it had been sitting in the lot file for 41 days, unflagged, because nobody had run the subsection 35.4 calculation, because the standard practice guide told assessors to assign grades, not to audit the grade against the species tables in Annex B. I opened a second compliance notice. I filed it under subsection 35.4. I flagged the Tier 0 recommendation itself as procedurally invalid, not just unexecuted, but retroactively void, because it had been made in violation of the minimum competency threshold. I copied the notice to the legal coordinator's office, the welfare registry, the session coordinator, and the KCCA Platform Oversight Board. The Platform Oversight Board was the key. They were technically external to the exchange, a regulatory body whose authority derived from the Vardath Contested Territory Accord, which meant they had independent standing that the exchange could not dismiss the way it could dismiss an internal notice. They were slow. They were bureaucratic. They were, under normal circumstances, utterly inconsequential. But a compliance notice formally addressed to them created a paper trail that existed outside the exchange's internal record management, and that paper trail was a different kind of wall. I had 24 minutes left when Suval Oker came back. He had the session coordinator with him. The session coordinator was a woman named Brath Isle, compact, gray-haired, 20 years in exchange administration, with a specific brand of administrative competence that expresses itself as a total absence of visible emotion in a crisis. She looked at my terminal. She looked at the 2 filed notices. She looked at me. Subsection 35.4, she said. The Tier 0 recommendation is void on its face, I said. The species baseline is Grade 4. Category 9 is a 5-tier overage. Subsection 35.4, Paragraph 1, no contract may be executed in excess of a 2-tier differential. That provision, Brath Isle said, applies to contract execution, not to grade recommendations. Paragraph 3, I said. Grade recommendations that, if executed, would constitute a violation under Paragraph 1 are themselves inadmissible and may not be filed as compliant assessments. The recommendation was filed as a compliant assessment. It isn't one. She was quiet for a moment. I watched her run the calculation, not the legal calculation, the operational one. How much time would it take to address both notices through the appropriate channels? How much administrative exposure the exchange had just acquired from the paper trail I had sent to the Platform Oversight Board? How the session coordinator of Vardith 7 Exchange would explain, in any subsequent review, why a mandatory hold and a minimum competency violation had both been sitting in a lot file for 41 days. "What do you want, Das?" she said. It was the same not-quite question Suval Oker had used, but she asked it differently, not as a man asking why you are touching something you shouldn't, but as an administrator asking what the price of the problem was. "I want the lot released," I said. "I want GX 4418 reclassified as a welfare hold case under Annex D. I want a caregiver tracing notice issued to the Transit Authority at Vardith 3, requiring them to identify and contact the primary caregiver of record. And I want a compliance certificate issued confirming that the Tier 0 recommendation has been voided under subsection 35.4. The Transit Authority at Vardith 3, Suval Oker said, will fight the caregiver tracing notice. The Transit Authority at Vardith 3, I said, holds a commercial operating license issued under the Kethavari Consolidated Commerce Authority's Contested Territory Framework. That license is renewed annually. The renewal application goes through this office. If the Transit Authority declines to comply with a formal caregiver tracing notice from a KCCA assessor operating under Annex D, that's a failure to cooperate with a regulatory obligation, and that goes on the renewal record. Suval Oker looked at Brath Isle. Brath Isle looked at the 2 notices on my terminal. "You understand," she said to me, "that what you're describing, the caregiver notification, the release, that's not a resolution of the lot, that's an open welfare case. The lot stays open. There's no placement. There's no revenue on this lot." "I understand that," I said. "If the caregiver is located and can demonstrate custody rights, the child is released to them. If no caregiver is located within the welfare hold period, the lot defaults to a residential welfare placement, not a labor placement." "That's what subsection 14.7 requires," I said. "Yes." "And if the Transit Authority at Vardith 3 contests the caregiver tracing notice, and the file goes to the Platform Oversight Board?" "Then it goes to the Platform Oversight Board," I said, "and everything I've filed today goes with it." There were 15 minutes left in the session window. Brath Isle sat down in the terminal chair across from mine. She had not sat down since she walked in, and the sitting was a signal, though I could not tell in the moment precisely what it signaled. She folded her hands on the terminal ledge. She looked at me with the kind of look that has years of administrative experience in it, the kind of look that has seen people pull regulatory maneuvers before and knows how most of them end. "You've worked in this office for 20 years, she said. "Yes." "You've filed 11 Tier 0 recommendations." "Yes." "And today?" The word sat in the air between us. I let it sit. "Today I read the file," I said, "and the file had irregularities that I am required as a KCCA assessor to flag. I flagged them. That's the job." "Das?" Her voice was not unkind. That surprised me a little. I had expected the administrator's flatness, the pure operational register. What I heard was something closer to a woman who had been in this building for 20 years and had her own version of the calculus I had been running all morning, and who recognized what she was looking at. If you pursue this the way you're describing, the oversight board, the renewal file on the transit authority, you're going to make enemies in places that have long memories. "I know that," I said. "Your assessor position here is not guaranteed if Oker files a conduct complaint." "I know that too," I said. "And you're still filing." "I'm still filing," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked down at the terminal ledge, at her own folded hands, and something in her expression shifted, not to sympathy exactly, but to something adjacent to it. The expression of a person who has been making the other choice for a long time and recognizes the cost of the choice she is watching someone else refuse. "Oker," she said, not looking at him, still looking at the terminal ledge, "process the welfare hold reclassification." He did not say anything for a moment. Then, Brath. "Process it," she said, "and pull the Tier 0 recommendation. File it as void, subsection 35.4. Get it off the record." She stood up. She straightened her jacket. She looked at me once more and she said quietly so that only I could hear it, "Some of those 11 DOS, if you look at them again the way you're looking at today's file, there may be findings." "I know," I said. "I'm going to look." She left. Suval Oker stood where he was for a few seconds. He looked at me with the flat gray eyes, and there was something in them now that was not patience and not anger exactly. It was the look of a man trying to understand when the room changed shape and how he failed to notice. "You've worked here for 20 years, he said. "Yes," I said. "And today?" "Yes," I said, "today." He left the door open again. I had 13 minutes in the session window. I used them to file one more document, not a compliance notice, not a regulatory flag. It was a request for external caregiver tracing, which was the form specified under Annex D, subsection 14.7, paragraph 4. It had a field for the juvenile's name. I typed FOS. It had a field for the species. I typed Oracy. It had a field for the last known location of the primary caregiver. I typed what she had told me. Freight hauler, Varda 3 Transit Authority hold, tariff dispute, approximately 51 days ago. I sent it to the Transit Authority at Varda 3, to the Platform Oversight Board, and to the KCCA's Contested Territory Welfare Office, which was a department I had never communicated with in 20 years of working for the same authority it served. The session window closed. The auto-grade triggered on every unresolved lot in the system at session close, exactly as Suval Oker had described. It ran in 17 seconds and it touched every open file on the assessor's terminal cluster, and it did not touch lot GX4418, because lot GX4418 was under an active compliance hold, and the auto-grade could not process a lot with an active compliance hold, and I had filed the compliance hold 29 minutes before close. I sat at the terminal for a while after the session window closed. The office was quiet. The platform's ventilation system ran at a steady hum. Somewhere in the distance, one of the cargo bay doors was cycling open and shut, the rhythmic hydraulic hiss of it, spaced about every 40 seconds. The other assessors were filtering back in for the post-session administrative hour, and they moved more quietly around me than usual, in the way that colleagues move around someone who has just done something that will be discussed at length once they are gone. I thought about the 11. I thought about them quite directly, without the vocabulary I had used for 20 years to avoid thinking about them directly, not the vocabulary of compliance frameworks and placement tiers and assessed grades, but the actual vocabulary. Children, names I could mostly not remember, faces I mostly had not looked at, held bays with feet not reaching the floor. 11 Tier 0 recommendations with my name on them. 11 mornings, I had walked into a holding bay with a tablet and a stylus and a drop-down menu with 4 options, and had chosen the 4th option, and told myself the story about numbers and systems, and how one assessor's grade didn't change anything. The thing about that story is that it was true. One assessor's grade did not change the system. Today had not changed the system. The Kethavari Consolidated Commerce Authority's Contested Territory Bonding Framework was exactly what it had been when I walked in this morning, and Suval Oker was going to run his operation on that framework tomorrow, and the Transit Authority at Varda 3 was going to run its intake process the same way it had been running it, and the compliance notices I had filed would go into the Oversight Board's external system and sit there, and the system would go on the way systems go on. What was different was that Foz was not in it. I wasn't going to unknow any of the rest of it. I had filed a welfare hold and a species baseline violation and a caregiver tracing request for one child, and somewhere in the Kethavari Consolidated Commerce Authority's regulatory machinery, those documents were moving, and Brath Isle was going to have a difficult quarter, and the Transit Authority at Varda 3 was going to have a compliance notice in their renewal file, and none of that was the 11. It was one, just one. But I had made her a promise, and the session window was closed, and the number on the form was not Tier 0. I took the service stairs back down. Foz was still on the bench, hands still folded, feet still not reaching the floor. The amber eyes came to the door before I was through it, the same way they had in the morning, the long-practiced attention of a child who has learned to read rooms before the people in them announce themselves. I sat down on the bench beside her again. I put the tablet on my knee, face down. "You filed something," she said. It was not a question. She had heard the ventilation shift that meant the terminal cluster was active, or she had counted the hours, or she had simply understood something in how I walked when I came back. "Several things," I said. "There's a hold on your lot. It can't be processed while the hold is in place." "How long is the hold?" 72 hours minimum. It may be longer depending on some other proceedings. She was quiet for a moment. "And after the hold?" "After the hold, the authority is required to attempt to contact your father. That's a mandatory step now because I've filed it as mandatory. They can't skip it." Another silence. She looked at her hands, then she looked back at me. "My father does not know how to navigate the contested territory legal system," she said. "If they send him a notice, he may not understand what the notice means or what he is required to do." I looked at her. This child who had spent 41 days on a bench with her feet not reaching the floor and had, in that time, apparently mapped every procedural barrier between herself and her father with the thoroughness of someone preparing testimony. "What does he speak?" I asked, "other than standard?" "He speaks standard well. He also speaks Orasi dialect Kethavari. His reading comprehension is good, but he is not a bureaucratic documents person." She said it without apology or embarrassment, just a fact. "The notice the Transit Authority receives will be in KCCA format," I said. "It's dense." I stopped. I thought about what I was about to offer and what it meant. I'll write a plain language version, something he can read and understand. A cover letter explaining what the notice is and what he needs to do and who to contact. I'll attach my contact information to it. The amber eyes were very still. "Why are you doing this?" she said, not with suspicion. With genuine precision, the same precision she brought to everything. A child who had learned to take nothing on faith and needed to understand the mechanism of each thing before she could trust it. It was a fair question. I had been asking it myself in a quieter register since approximately the moment I sat down on the bench that morning. "Because," I said, and I took my time with it, because she deserved the honest answer rather than the easy one. "I have a job that I have been doing for a very long time, and the job has a number of tools in it. And for 20 years I used most of those tools in the direction the exchange pointed me. And this morning I sat down beside you, and I looked at where that pointing had been going, and I decided I was done pointing in that direction." She listened to this, with the careful listening she applied to everything. "That is not an explanation for why you are doing it for me specifically," she said. "No," I said, "it isn't." I thought about how to say the rest of it. I thought about the moment she had been watching the door before I opened it, and the feet not reaching the floor, and the way she'd said before that I was home, not with grief, but with the particular resignation of someone who has already done their grieving and filed it somewhere they can reach it without being broken by it. "You were waiting for something to come through that door," I said. "You had already decided that whatever came through it was going to come through it and there was nothing you could do, but you were still watching. You hadn't stopped watching, and I thought I stopped again. I thought that someone who is still watching when they have every reason to stop is someone who deserves to have something worth watching for come through the door." She looked at me for a long time, the amber eyes held steady. "That is a more emotional reason than I expected," she said. Something happened in my chest that was probably a laugh, though it came out more like a breath. "Yes," I said, "I suppose it is." The ventilation system ran its steady hum. The cargo bay door somewhere above us cycled open, hissed shut, open, shut. "The hold is in place," I said. "You're not going to Tier 0. That recommendation is voided. It's on the record as void, which means it can't be reinstated without a new assessment, and any new assessment now goes through the welfare hold process, not the standard session process. That gives you protection that didn't exist this morning." "And my father?" "The notice goes to Varda 3. I will have the plain language letter done before the end of shift today. The transit authority is going to be motivated to cooperate, because their renewal file now has a compliance notice in it and they will not want more. Your father's ship, do you know if the tariff dispute is still active?" "I don't know," she said. "I have not had information about him since the transit authority separated us. I'll include in the letter a request that he confirm the ship's current status. If the tariff is the only hold on the vessel, that's something that can be addressed through separate channels. The Oracy freight guilds have legal advocates in the contested territory system. I'll put contact information for the Oracy Freight Guild Advocate Office in the letter as well." She was very quiet. "You know a great deal about the contested territory system," she said. "I've been reading it for 20 years, I said. "Most of it in the wrong direction. I know where the walls are. I know which ones have doors in them that the practice guides don't mention." She looked down at her folded hands. She looked at them for a while, then she looked back at me. "You said you made me a promise this morning," she said. "In this room. You said the number on the form would not be Tier 0. "Yes," I said. "You kept it." "Yes," I said. She nodded. It was a small, precise nod, not the performative kind, not a social gesture. The nod of someone who has received a piece of information and has logged it and is integrating it into their understanding of how things work. "I will remember that," she said. I stood up. I looked at her on the bench, small, folded-handed, feet not reaching the floor, silver hair close-cropped, pale green skin with the wrong undertone beginning, or so I thought, to reassemble some warmth. Maybe I was seeing what I wanted to see. I had been doing that all day, maybe, choosing to look at a thing and see the version of it that obligated me. I found I did not mind that. "I'm going to go write that letter," I said. "Someone will come down when the shift meal is ready. Welfare hold status means full rations. That's the welfare schedule. It's mandatory. Make sure they know your lot number so they don't skip you." "GX 4418, she said. "GX 4418. I got to the door, I stopped, I turned back. "Foz," I said, "when your father gets the letter, when the transit authority cooperates and the caregiver trace goes through, it may take time. These things take time. But the hold is in place, and the paper trail I filed today exists in the Platform Oversight Board's external records, and that means the exchange can't make it disappear. Whatever happens next, that much is solid. That's not going to move." She looked at me with the amber eyes. "I understand," she said. "Thank you, Assessor Das." I went upstairs. I sat at my terminal. I opened a blank document and I wrote the letter. Not in KCCA format, not in regulatory language, in plain words. In the words of a man explaining to another man that his daughter was on a platform 3 transit hops from where he last saw her, and that she was safe, and that she was waiting, and that there were specific things he needed to do to bring her home. And I numbered those things so they were easy to follow, and I put my contact information at the top in large, clear type. And I put the Oracy Freight Guild Advocates number below it, and I put the Platform Oversight Board's public inquiry line below that, and I went over it twice for anything I had missed. And I sent it with the formal caregiver tracing notice to the Transit Authority at Varda 3, with a cover memo, requiring them to forward it to the freight hauler Foz had named as her father's vessel at the time of separation. Then I sat for a while longer. The shift was ending. The terminal cluster around me was going quiet as the other assessors filed out, giving me the looks people give a colleague who has done something unprecedented, and are not sure yet whether it was admirable or alarming or both. 2 of them did not meet my eyes at all, which was its own kind of answer about what this morning had cost me in the currency of this office's social order. One, a young woman 3 years into her assessor tenure, Aurelie, who had always struck me as someone reading the practice guides with the same dissatisfaction I had once felt, stopped at the door and looked back at me with an expression that I catalogued and set aside for later. I let them give the looks. I had been giving myself a version of the same look all day. I opened the compliance reassessment form one last time, not for Foz, for my own file. In the 20 years of records under my assessor ID, there were 11 Tier 0 recommendations. Those records were not going away. I was not under any illusion that today had erased them, because nothing erases what is already filed. What I could do, what I was, in fact, required to do under KCCA regulatory obligations now that I was aware of the subsection 35.4 issue, was flag each of those 11 prior recommendations for a minimum competency review against the species tables in Annex B. I did not know how many of them would fail the review. I did not know what could be done, if anything, for children who had gone through Tier 0 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. I knew only that the review was something I could do, and that I should have done it 11 times before today, and that starting it now was not forgiveness of anything, but was at minimum the correct next move. I flagged all 11. I addressed the flags to the KCCA Welfare Compliance Office, to the Platform Oversight Board's external record system, and to myself, because I intended to follow up on every one of them, and the best way to make sure of that was to make my own name a party of record. Then I closed the terminal and I went home. The Transit Authority at Varda 3 forwarded the letter. It took them 6 days, which was faster than I had expected, and I suspected the compliance notice in their renewal file had something to do with the speed. Foz's father's name was Oral. I had not known that until he sent a message back through the platform's public communications channel, addressed to me, in carefully composed standard with Oracy dialect phrasings, and a line at the end that said, "I did not know where she was. I have been trying for 49 days to find out. Thank you for telling me where she is." I wrote back. I gave him the next steps in the same numbered format. I told him the hold was in place. I told him about the Oracy Freight Guild advocates and what they could do about the tariff dispute. I told him it would take time. He wrote again. His messages were brief, because he was, as Foz had said, not a bureaucratic documents person, but he was methodical and he did not miss a step I gave him. It took 4 months. The tariff dispute took most of that. The Freight Guild advocates had to establish that the original tariff assessment had been applied to the wrong vessel classification, which it had, which was a separate bureaucratic wrangle that I observed from a distance and did not directly intervene in because it was not my jurisdiction. The Platform Oversight Board's welfare hold review took another 3 weeks. Brath Isle's office pushed back twice on technicalities that both failed. Suval Oker filed the conduct complaint Brath Isle had warned me about. That proceeding ran for 6 weeks and was ultimately dismissed. The compliance notices I had filed were procedurally correct, and the KCCA had no grounds to discipline an assessor for flagging genuine violations, which was a conclusion the Conduct Review Board reached after a considerable amount of time that I had spent wondering each morning whether today was the day they would not reach it. I watched every step of it from my terminal in the assessor's office. I responded to every procedural query. I filed 3 supplementary compliance memos. I made calls to the Platform Oversight Board's inquiry line, which I had never called in my life before the day I gave Foz the number, and the people who answered it were surprised to hear from a KCCA assessor rather than a contested territory welfare advocate, but they took the calls. Foz stayed in the welfare hold during those 4 months. The welfare hold status meant full rations and a different holding bay, the welfare schedule facility, which had windows and a recreation allocation and a school-equivalent learning terminal. It was not home. It was better than the first bench. She sent me 3 messages through the platform's internal communication system. The first said, "The caregiver tracing notice was confirmed received by the Transit Authority." The second, about 2 months later, said, "My father has retained an advocate. The advocate says the tariff dispute has a procedural error in the original assessment. I think this will be resolved." The third came during the conduct review, and it said, "I am aware that a complaint has been filed about your handling of my case. I want you to know that I have prepared a written account of all relevant events in case it is needed. I have been told it may not be necessary. I have prepared it anyway." I wrote back, "I know you have. Good. Stay at the learning terminal." She wrote back one word, "Acknowledged." I sat at my terminal and looked at that word for a while, and then I went back to the minimum competency review files, because there was work to do. The release came through on a Thursday morning. I was at my terminal when the Platform Oversight Board's confirmation came in, and I walked it down to the welfare hold facility myself, rather than wait for the administrative process to carry it, because I had been at this terminal for 4 months, and I wanted to be the one who walked it down. Oral was already there when I arrived. He had come in on the morning transit. I don't know how he had timed it, whether someone had told him the confirmation was coming or whether he had simply been arriving on the morning transit for weeks and waiting in the welfare facility's reception area, until someone told him there was nothing yet again. He was a lean man, Oracy built, pale green where his daughter was pale green, with silver in his hair that might have been age or might have been native to his coloring, and silver eyes in place of her amber ones. He was sitting in the reception area with his hands on his knees, and he was watching the door with the same attention I had seen in his daughter 8 months ago, and I understood where she had learned it. She was in the doorway from the facility corridor before the administrator had finished processing the paperwork. She had heard the door, or she had heard his voice, or she had simply known, the way children sometimes know things that have no clear sensory signal. She crossed the room. She did not run, that surprised me, and then it didn't. She was a child who had learned that the world did not always deliver what you rushed toward, and she walked with the careful, deliberate step of someone approaching something they cannot afford to be wrong about. He stood up from the chair, and he was not careful at all. He dropped to his knees in the middle of the reception floor and opened his arms, and she came into them with a sound I had not heard her make in 8 months, a sound that was small and high and entirely unlike the composed, precise voice she had used for every other thing she had said to me. I stood in the doorway with the release confirmation in my hand, and I watched them, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying there that wasn't already being said. After a while she looked up, over her father's shoulder, amber eyes finding me in the doorway with the same attention they had given the latch on the first morning, the same long-practiced watch, only now it was landing on something worth landing on. I lifted the paper slightly. She looked at it, she looked at me. She said quietly, "You kept it." "I told you I would," I said. Her father looked up then at me. He said something in Orasi dialect that I did not have the vocabulary to follow, but the tone of it was plain enough across any language, and I gave the release confirmation to the administrator, and I nodded once and I left them there. I went back upstairs. I sat at my terminal. I opened the minimum competency review files, the 11 flags I had placed on the 11 prior recommendations, most of which were still working their way through the welfare compliance review. Some of them had already come back with findings. 2 had resulted in active welfare traces running through the Platform Oversight Board's external system. 1 had come back clean. The species in question did not appear in Annex B, which was its own problem but a different one. 8 were still pending. I did not know where any of them would end. I knew they were running. I knew that Orelli, the young assessor who had stopped at the door on the night of the session close and looked back at me, had come to my terminal 2 weeks later and asked me very quietly whether she could read the subsection 14.7 filing. I had sent her the archive links. I had not heard what she did with them yet, but I intended to find out. I worked for the rest of the day on the pending files. I filed what needed filing. I responded to what needed responses. At the end of shift, I sat in the quiet of the assessor's office, and I thought about the weight of what the morning had started, not just Foz, but the 8 pending reviews and Orelli at her terminal, and Brath Isle's expression when she had said some of those 11 in the voice of someone who had also been reading the archive in a language she had never let herself apply. I thought about the young woman in Tier 0 5 years ago whose file was now flagged and running, and whether running meant anything, and whether anything meant anything when the system itself was what it was. The ventilation hummed. The cargo bay door ran its patient cycle somewhere below. And I thought, a father is on a transit ship heading home with his daughter, and there are 2 welfare traces running in the external record system, and there are 11 flags with my name on them, and the conduct review came back dismissed, and Orelli is reading the archive. It was not the system changed. It was 1 door opened, and 1 child through it, and the shape of every subsequent morning shifted by 1 degree from the shape of the 20 years before. 1 degree is not much. Over time, across enough mornings, 1 degree is everything. I have never broken a promise since. I have not always kept them easily or quickly or without cost, but I have kept them, which is the only thing a promise ever actually requires. I went home. I came back the next morning. I opened the archive. There was still work to do.